Hey everybody, welcome to What's Up Wednesday. This week I want to focus on a topic I know I've touched on in the past, but kind of planning as it relates to safety performance, production, quality, all of those things. And I'm going to start out with kind of a summary of a book I just finished. So I was heading out on vacation, and this book looked really interesting, and I picked it up at Hudson News at the airport on my way to vacation. I just finished reading it. It's a really interesting book. I've always been intrigued by people who climb really big mountains like K2, Annapurna, and Everest. Uh, it's really, it's amazing the chances that they take to summit a mountain. And I know that, I thought about it when I was younger. I climbed Rainier when I was 12 or 13, but ultimately, I want to get a little bit into, this idea of climbing Mount Everest. Obviously, Mount Everest is the tallest mountain on the planet, which is why it's kind of the king of all mountains. It's 29,035 feet tall. It is considered an 8,000er is what they call them, or 8,000-meter peak. There are 14 of them, and they all lie between Pakistan in the west and Nepal, Tibet in the east of the Himalayas. So 14 8,000-meter peaks. And when we look at Everest, there were many, many attempts to climb this mountain up until 1953 when Sir Edmund Hillary and his Sherpa Tenzing Norgay stepped to the summit of Everest. In the process of the attempts prior to that, all of the other expeditions either turned around and abandoned their effort to climb, or they perished in the process of attempting it. Then from 1953 until really the 1980s, there were a lot of attempts and there were a lot of summits, but it wasn't until 1992 that the guide companies began to commercially guide clients up to the top of Everest. And the first client to be escorted, guided to the top was in 1992, and he was the 174th person to summit that mountain. Since 1992, there have been some years where they've had just absolutely horrendous incidents like 1996. There's a great book called Into Thin Air, and there was a movie written and developed about that particular year and a summit attempt where Scott Fisher, a famous guide, and Rob Hall from Adventure Consultants, who was the first guide in 1992 to successfully summit with client. They perished along with clients and Sherpa when they got caught in a storm. But when we look at that period from 92 until today, we're now averaging between 500 and 700 people summiting Mount Everest a year. How is that possible? It For so many years, and I wrote a blog about this last week, but for so many years, Everest was thought to be this insurmountable obstacle. And then once it was summited, people continued to make their attempts to summit the mountain, and more people summited. But then this idea that it could become a business, and that's hence the book Everest Inc. It talks about the business side of climbing Everest. But ultimately, the fact that they were able to make a business out of this and eventually make it safe, where their loss of life was very insignificant compared to the number of people attempting to climb the mountain and those actually achieving and summiting the mountain. Now, the biggest risks with climbing any 8,000-meter peak, and some would even say, anything over 20,000 feet tall, is obviously altitude sickness. And the two big ailments, if you want to call them that, are HAPE and HACE, which are high altitude pulmonary edema, which is in the lungs, and high altitude cerebral edema, which occurs in the head. And basically, as a result of the altitude and low oxygen, people more or less begin to hemorrhage and they die from those sicknesses. So those are the most common, in addition to getting caught in storms and avalanches and other accidents related to people making a mistake. They disconnect their fall protection, disconnect from the rope system, and they take a step and they lose their balance and they fall 5,000 feet. That happens pretty regularly. But ultimately, when we look at what's gone into climbing Everest, it's very much like the safety profession. We've made it safe by putting in systems and processes that ensure that people don't get hurt. So as an example, they have Sherpa rope teams that put in the rope systems from base camp all the way to the summit, and they make sure that their clients are tied off. And the amazing thing is, for many years, the only people who climbed Everest were experienced climbers with great rope and climbing skills. Now they can literally take a client who hasn't climbed a mountain and acclimate them to the altitude if they're capable, and they can walk to the summit of Everest. It's incredible with safety systems and protocols, in this case, supplemental oxygen and rope systems, how safe they can make something that is so incredibly dangerous. And even other mountains, there are at least three others that are far more dangerous than Everest. K2, the second tallest mountain, being probably the most dangerous, Annapurna, and there are a few others that are more technical. And yet, even today, the guides are taking clients to the tops of those mountains, which, again, for so many years, they weren't summitable because nobody succeeded in getting to the top. But ultimately, when we look at processes, this just shows that any obstacle, any challenge can be overcome with proper planning and proper safety protocols. And then they can build a system that results in successful completion of whatever that goal might be. So keep that in mind. Might be a great story for a safety meeting. Compare climbing Everest to building a building or doing a turnaround at a refinery, whatever it may be. Hopefully you find that helpful. We'll see you next Wednesday.